I've compiled a list of desserts, and I'm letting my computer randomly select 2 for me to combine. Let's see what the computer has me making this time. For those of you who've never seen a coconut cake, here's the gist of what it looks like. Apparently, it's a highly revered cake in the American South, served around the holidays and on other occasions like birthdays and anniversaries. Wikipedia defines coconut cake as a cake frosted with white frosting and covered in coconut flakes. So a pretty broad definition, but based on the survey I did on existing coconut cakes, I'd say that the broadness is appropriate. There are a lot of different recipes out there. Some where coconut is a predominant flavor, others where it's a secondary flavor in the background, and even others where lemon curd is involved. So being my indecisive self, I had a really hard time picking one recipe to serve as the reference point for coconut cake. I narrowed it down to 3 recipes where coconut is the predominant flavor, and the computer randomly selected this recipe by Stella Parks. Parks' recipe packs in the coconut flavor by replacing some or all of the butter, flour, and milk with their coconut counterparts, so virgin coconut oil, coconut flour, and coconut milk. Her recipe also uses a buttercream frosting, but I decided to go with a more traditional 7-minute frosting. Now, moving on to the conversation tart. According to Wikipedia, a conversation tart is a type of patisserie made with puff pastry that is filled with frangipane cream and topped with royal icing. So apparently this recipe was created in the late 18th century to celebrate the publication of a book by Louise d'Épinay called Emily's Conversations, a book that challenged the limited education traditionally given to women of the period. And at the book launch, each tart was topped with a small cross to remind the attendees that they should freely have discussions and debates and cross swords. Funnily enough, I had the opposite problem with this pastry than with the coconut cake. There aren't many well-curated recipes out there. Ultimately, I decided to use a recipe by Chef Damien on the YouTube channel 750 grams.
Un coup d'amande. Hop, on y va, les œufs là, tac.
I don't know.
En même temps. Là, oui.
Okay, so first I'm gonna make the coconut cake. Stop it! Stop! Get away from dinner! Get off. So let's review the defining characteristics of coconut cake. It's round and multi-layered. You can definitely taste the coconut, but it's not overwhelming. The cake isn't overly sweet, which really allows the coconut flavor to shine through. It's very moist, and it's kind of a dense cake, which could be a good or bad thing depending on your taste. The frosting is absolutely delightful. It's light and fluffy, almost like marshmallow fluff. And even though the cake itself is dense, the frosting and shredded coconut adds fluffiness to the cake. The frosting, however, is not the most stable of frostings. It's been super humid here, and this is what the cake looked like the next day. Frosting started to drip off the sides of the cake because 7-minute frosting is really just a Swiss meringue in disguise, and meringue doesn't hold up well in high humidity. This was a good cake, and I really appreciate that it doesn't taste artificially of coconut. Okie dokes, let's move on to making the conversation tart. let's define the characteristics of this conversation tart. Overall, the tart has a light sweetness to it, the pastry is buttery and flaky, the frangipane has a nutty flavor, and it's very cake-like. It's very moist and has a slight grittiness to it, but not in a bad way. You get a nice crunch from the caramelized royal icing, which kind of reminds me of the sugar coating on a Pop-Tart. The royal icing also looks like a baked meringue. Overall, a really delicious tart. Looking at it now, I am noticing that there's uncooked pastry bordering the frangipane. I'm not sure if that's something I could have avoided, given that I couldn't blind bake the pastry. So here are my ideas for the hybrid. Overall, the hybrid is going to look like a 2-layered cake. Each layer will have the structure of a conversation tart, meaning that I'm going to fully encase the frangipane batter in puff pastry. I toyed around with the idea of using cake batter rather than frangipane, but I was concerned that the excess moisture would leave me with a soggy pastry. Also, frangipane itself is already very cake-like. I'm going to sandwich a frosting between these 2 layers. Unfortunately, I can't use the Coconut Cake 7-mint frosting because the puff pastry will just absorb the meringue over time and become soggy. So to capture the marshmallowiness of the frosting without compromising the pastry, I'm going to use a disc of baked pavlova as the frosting. More on that later. To channel the conversation tart, I'm going to frost the top of the cake with royal icing. Specifically, I'll be topping the cake with a disc of baked royal icing. Crosses are a symbolically important component of conversation tarts, so I'll be piping a lattice pattern on the disc of royal icing. I'm also going to fill these spaces with toasted coconut flakes, because that is a hallmark of coconut cake. They use a shredded coconut to cover the cake's frosting. Lastly, I'm going to embellish the border of the disc with piped pavlova that's also been dusted with coconut flakes. And I'll adhere all the components together using royal icing. So the first thing I tackled was a puff pastry. I made the de trompe using the same recipe as before, chilled in the fridge for 1 hour, and moved on to making the beurrage. I wanted to incorporate coconut flavor throughout the hybrid, so I decided to use a 50-50 mix of butter and virgin coconut oil for the beurrage. Adding coconut oil to the beurrage lowers its melting point, so rather than making inverse puff pastry, I decided to stick with the traditional method of encasing the fat inside the dough. I wanted to make as little direct contact with this beurrage as possible. Right from the get-go, I ran into some issues. Virgin coconut oil is a creamy solid between 70 and 74 degrees Fahrenheit, but it was 65 degrees in my apartment, so the coconut oil was a very firm solid, preventing it from incorporating with the butter and flour. I salvaged the mixture by passing it through a fine mesh strainer and pressed on, shaping the beurrage and sticking in the fridge for 40 minutes before starting the lamination process. Following the traditional way of making puff pastry, I encased the block of fat inside the dough and used the same lamination procedure as before. After the final fold, this is what the dough looked like. As you can see, I didn't achieve perfect lamination. Some shards of coconut oil pierced the dough, but if nothing else, I've made some form of blitz puff pastry, which still works for our purposes. Here's a side-by-side comparison between the original inverse puff pastry and the virgin coconut oil puff pastry. We see a less prominent rise in the coconut oil version with less defined layers, which is fine because for the hybrid, my primary concern is to incorporate coconut flavor, not to get perfect lamination. After looking at the sample bake, I rolled the puff pastry to a thickness of 2 millimeters and cut out 2 large circles for the base of the tart and 2 smaller circles to top each tart. I wrapped these up and stored them in the fridge until it was time to construct the hybrid. Now moving on to the frangipane. To capture more qualities of coconut cake, I made a coconut frangipane, replacing some of the almond flour with coconut flour and some of the butter with virgin coconut oil. I messed up my first batch of coconut frangipane by adding an egg that was too cold. The butter and coconut oil solidified, curdling my batter. This curdling will affect the final texture, but I continued with the mixture and baked a sample to see if it actually tasted good. It's very sweet. Very coconutty. The coconut flavor works nicely with the nuttiness of the almonds, so I made a second batch, this time making sure to add a room temperature egg. I wanted each tart layer to be about 1 inch thick after baking, so I needed to know how much the frangipane batter expands in the oven. I piped a level layer of frangipane into a foil ring and baked it off, measuring the initial and end thickness to calculate the level of expansion. The batter expands by 20%, so later down the road, I factor this in when constructing the hybrid. There are 2 components to this hybrid that are made from pavlova, the frosting that's sandwiched between the 2 layers of tart, and the ring of piped frosting that sits on the royal icing disc. To make pavlova, you essentially just whip up a meringue and add cornstarch and an acid, either in the form of lemon juice or vinegar. The cornstarch creates that chewy edge underneath the pavlova's crisp exterior, and vinegar keeps the center creamy and tender. It took me 2 attempts to whip up a proper meringue. For my first pavlova attempt, I used a French meringue as my base, and admittedly, I was being a little lazy and didn't grind my toasted granulated sugar in the food processor before adding it to the egg whites. And not surprisingly, the sugar didn't fully dissolve into the egg whites. I baked it off anyway because I didn't want to waste it, but as you can see, undissolved sugar causes beading on the baked meringue. Still tastes good though. For my second attempt, I decided to use a Swiss meringue as my base, which involves cooking the egg whites and sugar over a water bath, then whipping it into glossy meringue. So with this method, I don't have to worry about undissolved sugar. Once I achieved stiff peaks, I added in cornstarch, vinegar, and vanilla, whipped on high for a few seconds, and transferred the uncooked pavlova to a piping bag. Like the frangipan, I didn't know how much an average pavlova expands in the oven, so I experimented with different disc diameters and ring sizes. I piped the pavlova onto the traced parchment paper, sprinkled the rings of pavlova kisses with toasted coconut flakes, and baked the pavlova at 200 Fahrenheit for 52 minutes. I then let the pavlova cool in the oven to prevent excessive cracking. Now moving on to the royal icing components. I made 2 batches of royal icing with different consistencies, top coat consistency and outline consistency. To make the disc of baked royal icing, I filled the base of a springform pan with top coat royal icing and baked it at 350 Fahrenheit for 15 minutes. Once the disc had completely cooled, I used the outline royal icing to pipe a lattice pattern on the disc. The goal was to recreate the crosses we saw on the Conversation Tart. I covered the diamond areas with toasted coconut flakes, using a layer of top coat royal icing as an adhesive, then topped the disc with a ring of pavlova kisses. To construct the 2 tart layers, I fashioned 2 foil rings out of aluminum foil and placed them on a sheet pan lined with aluminum foil. I then lined the bottom of each ring mold with puff pastry, then piped in a layer of frangipan and smoothed the surface using an offset spatula. I then placed the smaller disc of pastry flush on top of the frangipan and sealed the 2 layers of pastry together using some water. After chilling the tarts in the fridge for an hour, I weighed the tarts down using the base of a 5-inch springform pan and baked them off at 350 Fahrenheit for 75 minutes. Once the tarts cooled, I began assembling the hybrid. Construction was relatively straightforward, starting with 1 layer of tart, then a disc of pavlova, followed by another layer of tart, then finally the disc of royal icing. I adhered all the components together using a sparing amount of top coat royal icing. After several days of work, I can finally introduce to you the naked coconut cake, a hybrid between a conversation tart and coconut cake that's comically difficult to cut. The knife is stuck. Be decisive. Okay. Whew. But it actually tastes pretty good. It has a crunchy royal icing top, melt-in-your-mouth pavlova kisses, and a chewy marshmallowy pavlova middle. The frangipan is moist, but not as moist as the frangipan in the conversation tart. I think I may have overcooked the layers by about 15 minutes. The pastry is flaky and tender, and you can definitely taste the coconut in the frangipan and the pastry. The sweetness in this hybrid is really well balanced overall. One criticism of the cake is that it's brittle, making it difficult to eat the 2 layers of cake in one bite. You really end up eating the 2 layers separately. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this hybrid turned out, although it was a trying process. You can find the full recipe by following the link in the description. If you make this hybrid, please leave a comment telling me what you think, upload a photo on Instagram, and be sure to tag me. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments section what you would have done to hybridize these 2 desserts. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.